Dorothy Wallace had exactly $47 and a one-way ticket to Caldwell, Kansas, and she had told herself that would be enough to start over, finish strong, and never look back. The train rattled and shook beneath her as she pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching the flat Kansas prairie unroll like a bolt of brown cloth beneath a pewter sky. It was the autumn of 1882, and the plains were already going golden at the edges, the grasses bent low with the weight of the coming season. She was 24 years old, sharp-eyed and stubborn, with dark auburn hair pinned tight under a worn traveling hat and a carpetbag shoved beneath the bench seat that held everything she owned in this world. She had left St. Louis quietly, without ceremony, without the kind of farewell that anyone would bother to remember. She had left behind a man who had borrowed her savings, a landlady who had grown impatient, and the hollow feeling that she had been building someone else's life for the better part of 3 years and had nothing to show for it. Dorothy Wallace was not a woman who cried on trains. She had learned that early. Crying on trains attracted attention, and attention attracted questions, and questions led to the kind of pity that sat in your chest for weeks afterward like a stone. So she sat straight, watched Kansas come toward her, and thought about the advertisement she had cut from the St. Louis Dispatch with a pair of kitchen scissors 2 weeks before. It had read simply, "Housekeeper and cook needed for cattle ranch operation, Comanche County, Kansas. Room and board provided. Wages generous. 1-season contract available. Must be capable and willing. Inquire Fairchild Ranch, Caldwell Post Office." She had read it 3 times before she cut it out, and she had read it 3 more times since. 1 season. That was autumn through spring, roughly. 6 months of honest labor in exchange for honest wages, and then she could leave with enough money to set herself up somewhere proper. Denver, maybe, or San Francisco, somewhere with a future that didn't depend on anyone else's choices. 1 season she had promised herself, and she would leave richer, in the literal, practical sense of the word. The train pulled into Caldwell just after 2 in the afternoon, and the town hit her like the flat of a hand. It was a cattle town in the fullest sense, rough-edged and loud even in the autumn lull, with wide dirt streets and wooden storefronts, and the smell of livestock carried on every gust of wind. The stockyard sat at the southern end of town, empty now that the big drives were finished for the year, but still carrying their particular perfume. Men in dusty hats moved along the boardwalks with the particular unhurried confidence of people who had nowhere to be in a hurry, because every place they needed to be was already right here. Dorothy stepped off the train with her carpetbag and took a long breath of the cold prairie air and squared her shoulders. She collected the letter she had sent ahead from the post office, confirmed that it had been received and that the position was still available, and got directions to the Fairchild Ranch from a broadly built postmaster who looked at her with a kind of careful blankness that she recognized as the polite version of surprise. A woman traveling alone to a cattle ranch. She had learned not to explain herself in advance. A freighter heading south on the same road offered her a ride, and she climbed up onto the wagon bench beside a taciturn man named Pruitt who drove mules and asked no questions, which she appreciated enormously. The Fairchild Ranch announced itself by a painted gate on a wooden arch over the road, the name burned into the crossbeam in clean, even letters. Beyond it, a long dirt track led to a cluster of buildings that Dorothy took in with the methodical eye of a woman calculating her situation. There was a main house, 2 stories, white painted but not recently, the paint beginning to lift at the corners. There was a large barn, red and in good repair. Several smaller outbuildings. A bunkhouse set back from the main structures. Fenced pastures stretching south, and in them, cattle black and brown shapes moving slow in the afternoon light. The whole operation had the look of something that had once been well tended and was now being held together by determined effort rather than comfortable ease. Pruitt set her down at the gate with a nod and drove on, and Dorothy walked up the track with her carpetbag in hand, watching the place come closer. A man came out of the barn before she reached the house. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing canvas work pants and a blue flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the October cold. He had dark hair pushed back under a battered hat, and he moved with the particular economy of motion of someone who spent most of his day doing physical work that required precision. He was, Dorothy estimated, perhaps 29 or 30, with the kind of weathered good looks that came from years outside rather than anything deliberate. He stopped when he saw her, pushed his hat back an inch, and looked at her with clear brown eyes that held a frank, unhurried assessment that was different from the postmaster's careful blankness. It was not unfriendly. It was simply direct. "You're the woman who wrote about the position," he said. It was not a question. "Dorothy Wallace," she said, stopping a few feet in front of him and putting her carpetbag down on the ground so she could offer her hand properly. "From St. Louis most recently. I have experience in household management, cooking for large numbers and general domestic organization. I am healthy, capable, and not inclined toward dramatics." He looked at her hand and then shook it, and his grip was exactly what she expected: firm, calloused, brief. "Luke Fairchild," he said. "This is my ranch. It was my father's before that. He passed in April." "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it in the plain, simple way that she generally meant things. "He left the place sound," Luke said, as though he felt the need to establish that clearly. "It's a working ranch with full operation. I have 8 hands, a foreman named Amos Reed, and until 2 months ago a housekeeper named Mrs. Lyle who left when her sister took ill in Wichita. The house has been running poorly since." "What does the position require?" Dorothy asked. Luke Fairchild looked at her steadily. "Cooking breakfast and supper for myself, and whatever hands are eating at the main house, which is generally 4 or 5 on rotating days. Keeping the house in reasonable order. Helping manage supplies and provisions. I'm not a demanding man, but I am an organized one, and the house has gotten away from me these last weeks. Room and board provided," Dorothy said, recalling the advertisement. "And the wages? $30 a month," he said, "through spring roundup, which typically finishes the first week of May. You'd be free to go at that point with whatever you've earned, and I'll write you a letter of character that you can use wherever you like." Dorothy did the arithmetic in her head. 6 months at $30 was $180, plus whatever she still had of her 47. That was more than enough to build something real. "That's agreeable," she said. "I'd like to see the kitchen before I give you my formal answer." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. "Fair enough." The kitchen was a large, practical room at the back of the house, with a good iron stove, a long work table, adequate storage, and a window that looked out over the south pasture. It was in a state of organized neglect, which Dorothy found more encouraging than pure chaos. The bones were good. Someone had set up the space thoughtfully at some point, and she could see that it had been well used before circumstances had let it slide. The pantry was stocked, but in no particular order. The utensils were all there but hanging without system. "The stove drafts well?" she asked. "Perfectly," Luke said. "The water supply, pump out back, never runs dry. There's a cistern also for when you need hot water in quantity." Dorothy turned slowly in the kitchen, taking stock. Then she turned back to him. "I'll take the position," she said. "1 season as advertised." "1 season," he agreed. He showed her to a room on the 2nd floor of the main house, a small but clean room with a good bed, a window that faced east so the morning light would come in, a washstand, and a wardrobe. The floor was bare wood, swept clean. Dorothy set her carpetbag on the bed and stood there for a moment, and the thought came to her clearly and with surprising force. "This is the first room that has been mine in a very long time." She unpacked her things with the brisk efficiency that she applied to every practical task, and then she went back down to the kitchen and spent the remainder of the afternoon putting the pantry in order, because she had never in her life been able to sleep in a new place without first doing at least one useful thing in it. The 8 ranch hands ate supper that first evening with the particular careful politeness of men who had been told a woman was coming and didn't quite know what to make of it yet. There was Amos Reed, the foreman, a weathered and quiet man of perhaps 50 with a gray-streaked beard who was unfailingly respectful without ever being falsely warm. There were younger men, a Mexican cowboy named Ernesto, who was one of the best ropers Dorothy would eventually learn to watch from a distance, a cheerful redhead named Callum who seemed to be perpetually in trouble with Amos for something or other, and several others whose names she sorted out over the first few days. Luke Fairchild ate at the head of the table with the quiet authority of a man who ran his ranch as he ran himself, without noise and without waste. He did not make conversation for its own sake, but when he spoke, it was worth listening to. Dorothy noticed this the way she noticed most things quietly, without making a production of the noticing. She made bean soup and cornbread for that first supper, simple and solid, and when Callum said with great feeling that it was the best thing he had eaten in 2 months, she understood the full scope of what she had inherited from Mrs. Lyle's departure. Luke said nothing beyond, "Thank you, Miss Wallace," but he ate 2 full bowls, and she took that as the most straightforward form of compliment available. The rhythm of the ranch established itself around her in those first days with the natural efficiency of a well-designed system looking for its missing component. She rose before dawn to have breakfast ready when the hands came in from the early feeding. She managed the provisions with a careful eye, taking stock of what was depleted and what was wasted, and she sent a list with Amos on his next supply run to Caldwell that was more organized and more thoughtful than anything the ranch had apparently produced in months. She cleaned the main house top to bottom in the first week, not dramatically but steadily, so that by the end of the 7th day it looked as it should, and she could move into the quieter maintenance phase that she found most sustainable. Luke watched all of this without comment for the first week, and then on the 8th day he came into the kitchen after supper when she was finishing the washing up and leaned against the doorframe. "The hands have started showing up early for breakfast," he said. "That hasn't happened since my mother's time." Dorothy wrung out the dishcloth and hung it to dry. "The food was keeping them from wanting to come early," she said simply. "I know it was." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to apologize for the state of the house when you arrived. I should have been managing it better." She looked at him directly. "You were managing a cattle ranch and grieving your father and keeping 8 men employed while trying to hire a housekeeper. You did not fail the house, Mr. Fairchild. You had a full plate." Something in his expression shifted just slightly, like a door opening an inch. "My father always said this place ran on 2 things, good cattle and good management. He included everything in that, the house, the books, the people." He paused. "I was only ever taught the cattle half." "Then you're learning the rest," Dorothy said evenly. "That seems reasonable enough." He almost smiled. She noticed that he almost smiled quite often, that particular thing his mouth did where it got close to a full expression and then pulled back, as if he'd been taught somewhere along the way that smiling freely was a form of extravagance. She found it interesting. She also told herself very firmly that she was not finding Luke Fairchild interesting in any sense beyond the professional, because she had a plan, and the plan did not involve getting interested in her employer or in this flat, wide, wind-scoured corner of Kansas. The plan was simple. 1 season. Leave richer. That was all. October gave way to November with a cold that came off the plains like a wall. The days shortened dramatically, and the work of the ranch shifted into its winter rhythms, less driving and more maintenance. The cattle watched for weather stress, the equipment repaired, the outbuildings checked and reinforced. Dorothy put up extra stores against hard weather, organized the root cellar with methodical care, and began baking bread every other day because she had discovered that fresh bread in a cold house transformed the mood of every person who walked in the door, which she found practical information. She learned the ranch in the way she learned everything, by watching carefully and asking questions that had specific answerable answers. She learned from Amos which pastures had the best shelter and which were exposed, because this told her when the hands would come in cold and needing warmth. She learned from Ernesto, whose English was excellent and who was generous with his knowledge, about the cattle's particular habits and needs, which she found genuinely interesting rather than merely useful. She learned from the ledger books, which Luke left on the dining room table one evening, and which she had no intention of prying into, but which she understood at a glance represented a ranch in the process of rebuilding itself from the particular kind of financial strain that came from a long illness and then a death in the family. She did not comment on the ledger books. She had not been hired to comment on the ledger books. But she did, quietly and systematically, reduce the household expenditure by roughly a quarter simply through better organization of supplies, reduction of waste, and the intelligent timing of purchases. She did not tell Luke this. The evidence was in the numbers, and he was an organized man who would notice. He noticed in the third week of November. He came to find her in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, holding a supply receipt in one hand with a thoughtful expression, and said, "You've cut the household costs considerably. You can do that without cutting quality if you manage the waste and plan the purchases by season rather than by week," she said, not looking up from the bread dough she was working. "Where did you learn that?" "Running a boarding house in St. Louis for 2 years," she said. "Before that, my mother's kitchen. She could feed 8 people on what most women spent feeding 4. He sat down at the kitchen table, something he did not usually do, and she registered this without making anything of it. "You ran a boarding house," he said. "I managed it for the owner, a widow who had the property but not the energy. Dorothy turned the dough, pressed it, turned it again. It was good work, concrete. You know at the end of every day whether you did it well or not. What brought you to Caldwell?" She paused for just a half beat, then continued working the dough. "A change of circumstances," she said. "I needed a new situation, and your advertisement was specific about what you needed and what you were offering, and I appreciated the specificity." Luke was quiet for a moment. She could feel him deciding whether to press the question, and she appreciated that he decided not to. "Well," he said, standing, "whatever the reason, I'm glad you came." He walked back out to the barn, and Dorothy stood for a moment with her hands still in the dough, looking out the kitchen window at the pewter sky and the brown grass bending in the wind, and she felt something that she could only describe as warmth, and she pushed it neatly to one side the same way she pushed the dough to one side when it was ready to rest. One season, she reminded herself. That was the arrangement. But December came with a particular kind of cruelty that Kansas reserved for people who had not yet learned to respect it, and the blizzard that hit the ranch on the 15th of the month was the kind that the older hands spoke of afterward with the tone of people recounting a near thing. 3 days of wind and snow that turned the world outside the windows into a white wall, that froze the pump, that demanded the cattle be brought to the lower sheltered pastures or risk losing them. Dorothy spent those 3 days with complete unsentimental competence, keeping the stove fed around the clock, making sure there was always food ready for anyone who came in from the cold, heating water for the frozen pump, and managing the main house as a warm, ordered refuge in the middle of the chaos outside. She did not sleep more than a few hours in any of those 3 nights, and neither did Luke, who was in and out of the house a dozen times each day, covered in snow and ice, directing the work of moving the cattle, checking the horses, making sure every one of his hands was accounted for. On the second night of the blizzard, at some point past midnight, he came in from a final check and stood at the kitchen door dripping ice and snow, his face exhausted and cold beyond what a few minutes by the stove could fix, and Dorothy set a bowl of beef stew in front of him without being asked and poured him coffee, and then, because he looked like a man who needed simply to not be alone for a few minutes, she sat down across the table from him. He ate in silence for a while, and she sat with her own coffee, and the stove ticked and the wind screamed outside the walls, and it was, she thought afterward, one of the more companionable silences she had ever sat in. 3 of the heifers had calves early, he said finally, without looking up from his stew. Too early. We brought them inside the big barn. I can make a mash if you need supplemental feed for them. I know what ingredients you have. He looked up at her then, and there was something in his face beyond exhaustion, a kind of recognition, as though he had just seen something clearly that he had been trying to see for a while. You've been holding this whole household together for 3 days without anyone asking you to or even thanking you, he said quietly. You hired me to do exactly that, she said. Yes, he said, but not for 3 days without sleep. The job is the job regardless of the weather, she said, and then added, because it was true, besides, I'd have been lying awake worrying about whether anyone had eaten even if it wasn't my job. He was quiet for another moment, looking at her with those clear brown eyes, and then he said very simply, "Thank you, Dorothy." It was the first time he had used her given name. She registered it the same way she registered most things, quietly, precisely, without dramatics. But she also registered that it felt like something, like a small door opening a little further. You should sleep, she said practically. The cattle will still need managing tomorrow and you'll be useless on 4 hours. You should sleep, he said. I will when you do. He almost smiled in that particular way, and then he finished his stew and went upstairs, and Dorothy sat by the kitchen stove for another half-hour listening to the blizzard beat against the walls of the house, and feeling something she did not yet have a name for settling into her chest like warmth. The blizzard passed, and with it passed something else, some membrane of distance that had existed between Dorothy Wallace and Luke Fairchild, that was harder to maintain after 3 days in a blizzard together. It was not sudden or dramatic. It was simply that after that storm, they spoke to each other as people speak when the preliminary negotiations are finished and something real has begun. He started taking his morning coffee at the kitchen table rather than the dining room, because, she suspected, the kitchen was warmer, but she also suspected other things and kept those suspicions to herself. They talked in the mornings about the ranch, about the cattle, about the endless logistical demands of keeping a large operation running in the Kansas winter. She asked questions that were precise and curious, and he answered with the particular pleasure of a man who spent most of his days being the one with the answers and rarely had anyone ask good follow-up questions. She told him about the boarding house, about her mother's kitchen in Ohio, the farmhouse she'd grown up in, the 7 siblings she was the third of. She told him about St. Louis carefully, leaving the parts out that she was not yet ready to say the man who had borrowed her savings, the hollow feeling, the very practical and emotionally simple decision to leave. She told him the facts of it without the story that connected them, and he accepted the facts without pushing for the story, which was one of the things she was learning to appreciate about Luke Fairchild. He had a precise sense of what was his to ask. He told her about growing up on the ranch, about his father, Elias Fairchild, who had come to Kansas from Ohio himself in 1865 and built the place from nothing, who had been the kind of man who could look at a piece of ground and tell you in 10 minutes what it would support and how. He told her about his mother, who had died when he was 12, which explained the particular way he ran the household as a secondary concern, while understanding exactly why it mattered. He told her about the long illness that had taken his father through the winter of 1881 and into 1882, and the financial strain of paying for doctors and medicines, and how the ranch had come through it intact, but carrying a weight it was still working to shed. He told her about the winter before last, when a cattle buyer from Abilene had tried to underprice an entire season's herd, and Luke had refused the offer and driven the cattle to a different buyer in Caldwell at considerable additional expense, and how that decision had paid out, and how it had also shown him something about his own judgment that he needed to see. You trusted yourself, Dorothy said, warming her hands around her coffee cup. I trusted what my father taught me about the value of what you raise, he said, though it took me a while to trust it fully on my own account. That's the harder part, she said. Is that from experience? She was quiet for a beat. I spent a good while trusting someone else's judgment over my own, she said carefully, at some expense. He looked at her steadily over the table, and she could see him deciding again, and again he did not push. Well, he said, your judgment seems sound to me from everything I've seen. It's easier to see clearly when you're only answerable to yourself, she said. And then the stove crackled, and the morning broke open with light across the south pasture, and Amos came in the back door for his first coffee of the day, and the conversation folded back into the practical business of the morning. Christmas came with a warmth that surprised her. She had expected the ranch to mark the day with the kind of minimal acknowledgement that practical men in difficult circumstances generally offered holidays a nod and an extra cup of coffee. Instead, Luke came in from the barn on Christmas morning with a small pine branch that he had somehow located in the creek bottom where a few trees grew, and Callum produced a harmonica from somewhere, and Ernesto brought tamales wrapped in corn husks that he had been making in secret for 3 days in the bunkhouse, and Amos Reed, who had not displayed any particular festive tendencies in the preceding months, produced a bottle of very decent bourbon from a coat pocket, with the particular ceremony of a man presenting something he had been saving for the right occasion. Dorothy had baked 2 pies the day before, apple and dried peach, and made a proper roast with the good cut she had been setting aside. And when she set it all on the table and the men sat down together, there was something in the room that felt less like a cattle ranch in Kansas in the winter of 1882, and more like a family gathered around something it meant to keep. Luke sat at the head of the table and looked down the length of it at the food and the faces, and then at her, where she was standing by the stove getting the gravy, and the expression on his face was so unguarded for that single moment, something full and warm and open, that she had to look away from it because looking at it directly felt like looking at the sun. They gave each other small things after the meal. The men had organized this quietly among themselves. Callum had carved a small wooden spoon for her that was rough but earnest, and Ernesto gave her a hand-stitched kitchen cloth with her initials he had somehow worked into the border, and Amos gave her nothing but told her formally and sincerely that she was the best cook he had encountered since a woman in Santa Fe in 1871, and named the woman and the specific dish, which she found both amusing and oddly moving. Luke gave her a book. It was a small volume, cloth-covered, green, and when she turned it over she saw it was a collection of poetry, Emily Dickinson, published just 3 years before. She looked up at him and he was watching her with that careful, almost smile. "I didn't know if you read poetry," he said quietly, so only she could hear in the noise of the other men. "I do," she said, "very much." "I thought you might," he said. "You ask the kind of questions that people who read poetry ask." She looked down at the book and then back up at him, and she said, "Thank you, Luke." And it was the first time she had used his given name, and they both knew it, and neither of them said anything more about it, but the warmth in the room seemed to deepen by several degrees. The new year came in with a cold snap that made the December blizzard look conversational. The temperature dropped below zero for nearly 2 weeks in January, and Dorothy managed the house with the grim efficiency of a military campaign, keeping the pipes from freezing, keeping the fires fed, keeping the food warm and the larder organized and the men functional. She read the Dickinson poetry at night by lamplight when the house was settled, and she found herself marking particular lines with a piece of thread. She thought sometimes about a line she had read about being nobody. "I'm nobody." "Who are you?" And about the way she had come to Caldwell being quite deliberately nobody, with no ties and no claims and nothing to lose. She was not sure the description still fit her quite as cleanly as it had in October. She was also, with the honest self-awareness that had always been one of her better qualities, beginning to understand that her feelings about Luke Fairchild were operating outside the parameters she had set for them. This was inconvenient and clear-eyed, and she acknowledged it to herself without either panic or surrender. She felt for him. The precise word she chose in her own mind was felt, with a warmth and a specificity that was not the generalized fondness of an employee for a decent employer. It was particular. It was personal. It had grown quietly from the first morning conversations and the Christmas evening and the nights in the blizzard when he had said thank you with such genuine weight. She also knew her plan. One season. Leave richer. She turned this over in her mind the way you turn a coin, examining each side. Luke, for his part, was conducting his own internal negotiations that she could see in the careful way he moved around her. The precise calibration of his attention enough to be honest, not enough to be anything that would make her uncomfortable when they were still employer and employee in a professional arrangement that had specific terms. He was a man who respected terms. She had seen this in every dealing he conducted with buyers, suppliers, and his own hands. He said what he meant, and he kept what he agreed to, and he expected the same from others. But she saw him watching her sometimes when he thought she was occupied elsewhere, and she saw what was in that watching, and she thought about spring and leaving with $180 and a letter of character, and she felt the coin flip and flip in her mind, and neither side looked entirely clear anymore. February was quieter. The worst of the winter had passed, and the days began to lengthen in the small but perceptible way that the plains showed you spring was thinking about arriving even when it was still 6 weeks off. Dorothy took advantage of the slightly more moderate days to do things she had been putting off: a thorough cleaning of the upstairs rooms, an inventory of the linen and household stores, the patching and mending of curtains and bedding that had been accumulating minor damage for a season. She found herself one afternoon in what had been Luke's father's study, a room she had been avoiding because it felt like a private space, because she was looking for a spare lamp chimney that Luke had mentioned was stored there. The room was preserved rather than neglected, the way you preserve something you are not yet ready to let go of. A desk with the books still on it, a good chair, a pair of boots by the door that no one had moved, a framed tintype on the wall of a man and a woman in their wedding clothes who Dorothy recognized in the man's eyes, and the woman's chin as Elia's and his wife, Luke's parents. She found the lamp chimney on the second shelf she checked, and was turning to leave when she saw, on the desk, a small leather-bound journal that was open to a page in the middle, as if someone had been reading it recently and left it there. She did not read it. She was not a woman who read other people's private things, but she saw the date at the top of the visible page, which was May 1882, just weeks before Elias Fairchild's death, and she saw 3 words at the beginning of a sentence that she could not help seeing because they were at the very top of the page: "This ranch needs." She left the room quickly and did not come back. But she thought about those 3 words, the beginning of a sentence she had not read and would not read, and she thought about Luke carrying whatever was in that sentence, and she thought about the ranch and what it needed, and she thought about what she needed, and she thought about the coin still turning in her mind, and she was honest enough to know that the sides were no longer equal. She had expected to leave richer, and she was going to leave richer. She had never thought to examine what rich meant when you applied it to something other than dollars. She found an opportunity to say none of this, obviously, because none of it was hers to say. She was the housekeeper, hired for 1 season with a clear contract, and Luke Fairchild was a man who respected terms. So she went back to the kitchen and made supper and kept her thoughts where they belonged, in the particular private space that she had always been very good at maintaining. But then March came. March came, and with it the very first edge of warmth, the thin, tender shoots of green beginning to show in the south-facing slope below the barn, and the cattle growing restless and beginning to move differently, and the particular quality of light that happens on the plains in the first weeks of spring, when everything that has been gray and flat for months begins to remember that it has color. And Luke Fairchild, who had been maintaining the careful, calibrated distance of a man who respected terms, went and ruined everything on a Tuesday afternoon by being kind. She had been carrying a heavy load of firewood from the woodpile, which she did not need to do because that was not strictly her job. But the regular hand who stacked the kitchen woodbox had developed a cold, and she had not wanted to bother anyone with it. Luke came around the corner of the house and saw her, and before she could say anything about being perfectly capable of managing it, he took the wood from her arms so smoothly and naturally that it wasn't even a question. And then, instead of going directly inside, he stopped and looked at her and said, "You have been carrying things for 6 months that you don't have to carry alone." It was a sentence about firewood. It was also not about firewood at all, and they both knew it. Dorothy looked at him in the pale March light, the first real light in months, and she said, "I came here with a plan." "I know you did," he said. "One season," she said. "That was the arrangement." "It was," he said. He was looking at her directly, the way he looked at everything, with complete, honest attention, no hedging, no performance. "I told you when you arrived that I hoped you would find what you came for. I still hope that." He paused. "I also hope you have found things you didn't come for." She was quiet for a long moment, looking at him, at the ranch behind him, at the thin green beginning to show on the slope below the barn, at the sky, which was for the first time in months a genuine and unambiguous blue. "What kind of things are you hoping I've found?" she asked. "The kind that make a person reconsider their definitions," he said simply. And then, because he was a man who said what he meant without embellishment, he said, "I am in love with you, Dorothy. I have been since somewhere around December, and I have been very carefully not telling you because you had a contract, and I had no right to make that complicated. But spring is coming and you will be free to go in 6 weeks, and I cannot let you go without telling you the plain truth of it." Dorothy set her hands at her sides and looked at him and felt the coin stop turning for the first time in 4 months. She said, "I came here to leave richer." "I know," he said quietly. "I meant financially," she said. "I had $47 and a plan." "I know that too. I've saved almost $120 over the last 6 months," she said. "I have every cent of it upstairs." "Good," he said. "You earned every one of them." "Luke," she said, and she stopped. He waited. He was very good at waiting. She had learned this about him early, that he did not fill silences with noise, that he understood silence as a thing with its own content, and he gave it space. "I stopped being entirely sure I wanted to leave in January," she said finally. "I have been trying to talk myself back to certainty since then, and I have not managed it." The expression on his face was not triumphant or relieved in any dramatic way. It was simply the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has just been told he can set it down. "Then don't leave," he said. "Or leave if you need to, but know that I would very much like you to stay." She stepped toward him, and because she was Dorothy Wallace and she did not do things halfway when she had finally made up her mind to do them, she reached up and put her hand against his jaw, which was cold from the March air and rough with a day's worth of beard, and she looked at him clearly and said, "I would like to stay." He put his hand over hers, and then he bent down and kissed her, and it was exactly what she would have predicted, direct and honest and without any unnecessary qualification. And the thin March wind came up from the south, and the green grass on the slope below the barn bent in it, and the cattle in the south pasture moved in their slow, deliberate way. And above it, all the sky was so deeply and plainly blue that it looked like the kind of sky you only got at the beginning of something. They did not rush anything. They were both, in their own ways, people who had been hurt by rushing, by trading the real for the quick version of things. They were also both, in their own ways, people who knew their own minds once they had made them up. And it was with this that they proceeded through March, with a quiet and happy deliberateness that the whole ranch could see, and that no one commented on directly, but that Callum once nearly ruined by starting a sentence at supper that Amos stopped with a single look. They rode out together on the first genuinely warm Saturday of March, saddling up after the morning work was done and riding south along the creek, where the cottonwoods were beginning to bud. And Luke told her the history of every pasture and every feature of the land with the fluency of a man who has had the story of a place in his blood since birth. and she listened with the particular quality of attention she gave to things she meant to keep. He pointed out where his father had planted a windbreak of trees in 1868, and how those trees were now 30 feet tall and sheltered the north pasture from the worst of the winter winds. He showed her the spring that fed the creek, bubbling up from the ground in a small, clear, insistent way, and said his mother had liked to come here when she needed quiet. "Why did you never leave?" Dorothy asked. It was a genuine question, not a challenge. She had met enough men of his generation and quality who had gone west to California or north to Montana or east to the cities because the land wasn't enough to hold them. Luke thought about it honestly, the way he did. "I could not imagine being anywhere else," he said finally. "This land is my father's work and my mother's love and 100 years of weather and cattle. When you have grown up knowing every inch of a place, it becomes, I don't know a better word than part of you. To leave would be to leave a part of myself, and I have never been interested in doing that." Dorothy looked out over the brown and green land, the flat, wide, magnificent country that she had arrived in thinking of as alien and was now thinking of as comprehensible as possible. "I grew up on a farm in Ohio," she said. "We left when I was 15 because my father's health failed and we couldn't manage it. I spent a very long time after that moving from place to place, managing other people's things, living in other people's spaces. I think I was so focused on collecting enough resources to have my own place that I forgot to notice whether any particular place felt like mine." "Does this one?" he asked. She looked at him and then at the land, and she was honest. "More than anywhere since Ohio," she said. He did not say anything, but he reached across and covered her hand where it lay on the saddle horn, and they rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon light with the particular warmth of people who have arrived at an understanding that does not need a great deal more of words. April was lambing season on the neighboring ranch, whose owner, a broad Scottish man named Angus McCready, occasionally brought his problems to Luke's gate, because the two had developed the kind of neighboring relationship that the frontier made between men who had the sense to recognize that proximity was a form of mutual insurance. Macready arrived one morning with a problem that was not lambs. He had received word that a land buyer from a real estate syndicate in Kansas City was moving through the county making offers on ranches, and he was concerned about the implications. This was a genuine concern in 1882 Kansas. The big land syndicates had been buying up property throughout the cattle territory, and the men who sold often regretted it quickly, and the men who refused often found themselves facing pressure, water rights disputes, fencing conflicts, legal maneuvering designed to make operation difficult. Dorothy sat at the kitchen table while Luke and Angus talked at the dining room table and listened to the conversation with a careful ear. And after Angus left, she came to Luke with the ledger book she had been working with for 6 months, and she sat down with him. And they went through the ranch's financial position with a systematic honesty that was, she thought, probably overdue. The ranch was not in danger, but it was carrying enough residual debt from Elia's illness that an extended period of poor cattle prices would create real difficulty. Luke knew this. He looked at the numbers with the expression of a man looking at something he has been aware of but has not wanted to fully face. "There are things that can be done," Dorothy said, carefully. "I'm not trying to step outside my position here." "You are not outside your position," he said firmly. "You have been managing this household for 6 months with better judgment than anyone I have hired. Tell me what you see," she told him. She went through the household accounts first, where she had already made significant improvements, and then she walked him through the supply and provision costs, and she talked about the pattern she had observed in when and how he sold cattle selling at the end of season because the drives always came then, but accepting the buyer's price rather than holding for the better price the next month when the buyer's urgency faded. She had learned this from listening, from the conversations at the dinner table, from the things Ernesto said when he talked about the markets he had seen in Texas. Luke listened to all of it without interrupting, which was one of the qualities she had come to admire in him, his genuine capacity to listen to someone else's thinking without feeling diminished by it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "My father would have liked you." "That's not feedback on my financial analysis," she said. He almost smiled. "Your analysis is excellent," he said, "and you're right about the timing of the sales. I've been doing it on the buyer's schedule because that's how it was always done. I need to be doing it on my schedule." "You need to do what you did with that Abilene buyer," she said. "Trust your own judgment about the value of what you raise." "I trust my judgment more when you're looking at the numbers with me," he said, looking at her directly. "Then let me keep looking at them with you," she said, and the words came out with more weight than she had intended, and they both understood the full scope of what she was proposing. He took her hand across the table and held it. "Is that a contract renewal?" he said, and there was warmth in his voice that she had been hearing for months and would, she thought, like very much to keep hearing for considerably longer. "Something better than a contract," she said. He kissed her hand and said nothing, which was the right response, and they went back to the ledger books together. The land buyer arrived in the third week of April, as McReady had predicted, a smooth, well-dressed man from Kansas City named Theodore Halcombe, who came up the drive in a rented buggy with polished boots and a briefcase full of papers. He had the particular practiced friendliness of a man who had made many approaches before and knew the speech required for each type of person. Luke received him on the porch with courteous firmness, which was, Dorothy thought from her position at the kitchen window, exactly the right tone. She watched as Halcombe produced papers and began to speak in a reasonable, pleasant voice about fair market values and the advantages of liquidity and the challenges of maintaining a cattle operation in the current economic climate. She watched Luke listen to all of it without expression, and then say, in his direct and unembellished way, that he was not interested in selling and was not likely to become interested in selling, and that if Halcombe had any other business in the county, Dorothy was sure he could find Angus McReady willing to give him a similarly definitive answer. Halcombe left with the particular dignity of a man who has been politely and absolutely refused and knows there is nothing to be done about it. Luke came back into the kitchen and Dorothy handed him coffee without a word. "He'll try to make it difficult," Luke said. "Probably," she agreed. "But you have clear title and water rights and no debt he can leverage, and you know your land and your operation better than any syndicate lawyer who has never been west of Topeka. I would not worry too much." "I don't worry too much about the things I can't control," he said. "I worry precisely about the things I can control and then let the rest go." "That's a reasonable system," she said. "My father taught me that too," he said, and the way he said it simply, with a kind of steady warmth, told her everything about who Elias Fairchild had been and what he had left behind in this son of his. And she felt the weight of that inheritance and thought it was a very good kind of weight to carry. Halcombe did, in the following 2 weeks, attempt to create a water rights dispute involving a fence line on the eastern boundary of the ranch. A legal claim that was thin and obviously motivated, as Amos observed with measured scorn. Luke handled it by hiring an attorney in Caldwell, who resolved it in 3 days by producing the original survey documents and Elias Fairchild's deed from 1866, which were exactly in order, and Halcombe moved on to a more pliable county. Spring roundup began in the first week of May, and the ranch came alive with the organized intensity of serious work. The cattle gathered from their winter pastures, counted and sorted, the calves born through the winter now strong and healthy, and demonstrating that the hard work of the winter had been worth it. Dorothy rode out with Luke on the second day of roundup, not to work the cattle but because he had asked her if she wanted to see it, and what she saw, the hands working with the seamless competency of men who knew exactly what they were doing, Ernesto moving his horse through the herd with a fluency that was genuinely beautiful, Amos directing the work with brief, decisive instructions that needed no elaboration. Luke moving among it all with the quiet authority of a man who was home in the fullest sense was something she committed to memory with great deliberateness. This, she thought, this is what I decided to stay for. And riding back to the ranch in the late afternoon light, the cattle settled in their night pasture, the hands tired and good-humored, the sky going gold and rose behind the distant line of the horizon. She understood something she had been working toward all winter without knowing it, that rich was a word that could absorb a great deal more than money, and that she had arrived in this place with a correct instinct about the word and an incomplete definition of it. She had been right that she would leave richer. She had been wrong about every single specific thing it was going to mean. On the 10th of May, the day after spring roundup officially concluded, Luke asked her to walk with him to the creek, and she knew from the particular way he asked, quiet and deliberate, and with a formality that was unusual even for him, that whatever they had been moving toward all these months was about to arrive. The creek ran full and cold in the May light, the cottonwoods in full leaf now, their new green brilliant and clean, and the sound of the water over the stones was one of the more beautiful sounds she had heard since coming to Kansas. They walked along the bank for a while in companionable silence, and then Luke stopped and turned to face her. He had thought about what he was going to say, she could tell. He had the look of a man who has prepared something and is now finding that the thing he prepared is exactly what he means. I have been thinking about what to offer you, he said. Not as a contract, and not as wages, and not as an arrangement with terms. I have been thinking about what I genuinely want, which is for you to be my wife, and I have been trying to think of the right way to say it. Dorothy looked at him, at his honest, weathered face in the May light, at the man who had given her poetry for Christmas and carried firewood without being asked, and listened to her talk about ledger books with the same quality of attention he gave everything, at the man who had said I am in love with you without performance or embellishment, at the man who had let her come to her own conclusions in her own time. That is exactly the right way, she said. Is that a yes? He asked, and there was something young in his voice that she had not heard before, a young and open hopefulness that was one of the most moving things she had ever encountered. That is absolutely a yes, she said. He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a ring, small, plain gold, with a simple stone that caught the light in a quiet way, and she recognized it even before he said it was my mother's as something that had been waiting for the right moment for a very long time. He put it on her finger and then he held her hands and looked at her and said, I hoped, all the way from October, that you would redefine what you meant by leaving richer. I know you did, she said. I was paying attention. You are always paying attention, he said. It's one of my better qualities, she said. He laughed, a full, open laugh, the first time she had heard him laugh without any of the careful almost quality, and she thought, there it is. There is the full version. And she put her arms around him and held on, there by the creek in the May sunlight with the water running over the stones and the cottonwood leaves turning in the thin, warm wind, and she felt richer than she had ever calculated being. They married in June at the Caldwell Church, a ceremony that was small and honest and exactly suited to who they were. Dorothy wore a dress of pale blue wool that she had made herself from material purchased at the Caldwell dry goods store, and it was, by any standard, a beautiful dress. Amos Reed stood up for Luke with the gruff solemnity of a man doing full justice to a serious occasion. Ernesto and Callum sat in the front pew and tried to look appropriately dignified, which they managed with varying success. Angus McCready came with his wife, a small, fierce Scottish woman named Bess, who took Dorothy's hands in both of hers before the ceremony and said, with direct and total sincerity, that man has needed someone like you since before he knew he needed someone, which was the most useful piece of pre-wedding intelligence Dorothy had ever received. The minister spoke words that Dorothy heard with her full attention, because she was a woman who believed in full attention, and when she said I will she meant it in every possible tense, past, present, and future. And when Luke said it, she saw in his face that he meant it in exactly the same way. The ranch received them back in the afternoon, the whole property golden in the summer light, the cattle in the pastures, the barn standing red and solid, the white house that was going to need new paint by autumn, and which Dorothy had already mentally scheduled for a painting operation in September. They ate the supper that Ernesto and Bess Macready had conspired to prepare while they were at the church. A genuine celebration of a meal, everything good and plentiful, and made with the particular care of people who were genuinely happy about what was being celebrated. Callum played the harmonica after supper, and they danced in the kitchen with the furniture pushed back, Luke and Dorothy moving together with the slightly careful competency of two people who are both better at dancing than they expected the other to be. And Amos took a single turn with Bess Macready that suggested he had at some point in his past been quite a dancer. And the lamplight was warm, and the summer night was warm through the windows, and Dorothy looked at everything around her and felt the precise and unambiguous weight of happiness. That first summer of marriage was a revelation in the specific and practical sense. Dorothy Wallace, Dorothy Fairchild now, though she would carry both names in her own mind, having earned both, found that sharing the management of the ranch openly rather than from the careful position of an employee changed every single thing about the work. She took over the books fully, not by unilateral decision, but by natural evolution. She had the clearer head for numbers, and Luke knew it, and had the generosity of a confident man to say so without complication. She organized the household operations into a system that was more efficient and more pleasant than anything that had existed before, and she brought the same quality of attention to the ranch's larger operations that she had brought to the kitchen. The cattle prices that fall were better than the spring, as she had predicted, and Luke sold at the later date to the better buyer, and the result was exactly what the numbers had suggested. Amos told Luke in Dorothy's presence, with the bluntness that was his particular form of warmth, that Miss Wallace, he never quite managed to shift to Mrs. Fairchild, had better instincts for the market than any of the buyers he had watched come through Caldwell in 20 years, and that Luke had better listen to her on the subject. Luke told him he was already doing that, and Amos said good, and that was the end of the conversation. The land syndicate made no further moves against the ranch, which Dorothy credited partly to Halcomb's departure from the county and partly to the very clear documentation of the ranch's legal and financial standing that she had organized and filed in the Caldwell Records office in July, which was not strictly necessary, but which made the records absolutely unambiguous in the event of any future challenge. Preventive, she explained to Luke when he saw the documentation. I can see that, he said. When did you do this? 3 weeks ago, she said. I went to town with Ernesto's supply run. He looked at her with the particular expression he had, the one that was equal parts admiration and warmth. What else are you quietly taking care of that I haven't noticed yet? He asked. You'll notice, she said serenely. That's the point. He kissed her and went back to the barn, and she went back to the books, and the partnership of them, its particular texture and reciprocity, felt in that moment exactly like what she had always, underneath all the plans and practicalities, been looking for. The first winter of their marriage was nothing like the first winter of her employment. It was warmer in the most fundamental sense, not because the Kansas cold was any less. It was ferocious that year, with another significant blizzard in February that lasted 2 days and dumped 3 feet of snow, but because everything was different when you weathered it together without the polite membrane of professional distance. They sat by the kitchen stove in the evenings with the lamp between them, Luke reading range and cattle reports, Dorothy reading her Dickinson or the practical homesteading guides she had begun collecting, and the comfortable silence between them had none of the earlier reserve. It was simply the silence of two people who had run out of words for the evening and were happy to be in the same room. She told him the full story of St. Louis that winter. The whole of it, The man whose name was James Harker, who had been charming and handsome, and who had borrowed 3 years of her trust, and every dollar she had managed to save over 2 years of boarding house work, and who had left for Chicago one Tuesday morning with all of it, and left behind a note that explained very little. She told it plainly, without drama, because she had had more than a year now to sit with it, and she had reached the stage where it was simply a thing that had happened, a lesson that had cost more than it should have, but that had, in the end, brought her here. Luke listened to all of it without interruption, and when she finished he said, quietly and with controlled feeling, "I'm sorry that happened to you." "It's done," she said simply. "Yes," he said, "but it was wrong and you deserved better." He paused. "The fact that it brought you here doesn't make it right." "No," she said, "it doesn't, but the way things unfold has its own logic even when parts of it are unjust." She looked at him. "I spent a long time being angry. I'm not angry anymore." "What are you instead?" he asked. She thought about it. "Grateful," she said at last, "carefully and completely grateful, not for what Harker did, for what I found at the end of it." He took her hand and held it. Outside, the February wind was making its particular noise against the eaves, and the fire was steady and warm, and the ranch was quiet. In the spring of 1884, Dorothy told Luke that she was expecting. She told him on a Tuesday morning at the kitchen table, over coffee, in the plain and direct way she told everything. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had never quite seen on his face before, something that was beyond happiness, that was deeper than happiness. That was the particular weight of a man understanding that something is about to change irrevocably, and finding the change exactly right. He stood up from the table and came around and held her, and she put her arms around him and felt his heart beating against her ear, and neither of them said anything for a long while. Their son was born in October of 1884, a Tuesday delivery, and Dorothy, who had done nothing in her life halfway, had the baby with the same determined competency she brought to all things, though she was privately prepared to admit afterward that it was considerably more demanding than managing a blizzard. The baby was large and healthy, and had his father's brown eyes from the very beginning, and they named him Elias Wallace Fairchild, for his grandfather and for his mother both. Luke held his son with the careful precision of a man holding something he has never held before and is absolutely determined to hold correctly, and his face had the unguarded openness of a man who has set down every weight he has ever carried and is standing in clear air. Dorothy watched him from the bed, tired beyond description and happier than she had known it was possible to be, and thought about the October morning she had walked up the track to this house with $47 and a plan, and thought about the particular and vertiginous distance between that morning and this one. Little Elias was a serious baby who watched everything with wide, attentive eyes that his father said reminded him strongly of Dorothy, and Dorothy said they reminded her of Elias, the elder's portrait in the study, and they agreed that he had perhaps the best of both lines. He grew quickly through the winter, and the ranch reorganized itself around the particular gravity of a baby the way ranches always do. The whole operation subtly tilted in the direction of the small room upstairs where someone new was learning about the world. Amos Reed took one look at Elias and declared him a good size, which was the warmest thing Amos ever said about a baby, and Ernesto made a small carved wooden horse and left it on the porch without comment, and Callum, who by this point had been on the Fairchild Ranch for 3 years and showed no signs of leaving, simply looked at the baby with the expression of a young man encountering something that rearranges his understanding of the world and said, "He looks like a Fairchild." "He is a Fairchild," Luke said simply, looking at Dorothy when he said it. She smiled at him across the baby's head, and it was the kind of smile that doesn't need anything added to it. The ranch in the years that followed grew with the steady and purposeful confidence of a well-managed operation. Dorothy's financial management and Luke's cattle expertise proved to be a combination that the ranch responded to with expanding prosperity, not dramatic or sudden prosperity, but the deep, accumulating kind that comes from consistent good judgment applied over time. By 1885, they had cleared the last of the debt from Elias the Elder's illness and stood free, and Dorothy spent one evening going through the books after that final payment and felt a satisfaction that was worth noting. She noted it in the household journal she had begun keeping when she married, a methodical record of everything provisions, weather, cattle figures, expenses, the small events of the ranch's life, and she wrote on the day they cleared the debt, free and clear, as it should be. Little Elias was walking by then and had the wandering habits of a child, convinced that the next field over contained something better than the current one, which meant that someone was generally keeping track of where he was at all times. He was particularly attached to Ernesto, who had an endless patience for children and who taught Elias the names of things in both English and Spanish, which Dorothy found delightful and Luke found practical and Amos found mildly alarming, but accepted because there was clearly no alternative. In the summer of 1886, a drought year that tested every rancher in Comanche County, Dorothy's organizational competency and her habit of running provisions carefully against seasonal uncertainty proved to be the difference between genuine hardship and managed difficulty. She had been building reserves more aggressively than usual through the previous 2 years, with an eye on patterns she had read about in the farming papers, the cyclical dry periods that the plains produced every 7 to 10 years. She had not mentioned these reserves to Luke with any fanfare, because she had learned that the most effective management was the kind that was simply in place when you needed it. When the drought came in July, and the water in the creek dropped and the grass went brown and the cattle began to show stress, the Fairchild Ranch was better positioned than most of their neighbors because there was feed in reserve, and there was money in the bank against the lower cattle prices that always followed a drought year. Luke looked at her one evening in August, when the heat was still pressing down at sunset and the land looked tired and pale, and said, "How long have you been planning for this?" "Since 1884, she said. "I read about the 1874 drought and did some arithmetic." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, with a quality in his voice that was beyond admiration, "I am quite convinced that you are the most capable person I have ever known." "I have good material to work with," she said. "The ranch is sound. The cattle are good. You built something worth protecting." "We built it," he said. She thought about this. "Yes," she said. "I suppose we did." They helped Angus and Bess McCready through the worst of the drought with feed and water access, because the creek ran through the south corner of the Fairchild land, and they had no legal obligation to share it but every human one. Angus came to the house on a late August evening with his hat in his hands, which was an unusual posture for a man of his bearing, and said simply that he would not forget it. And Luke said that neighbors who forgot things were poor neighbors and said no more about it. The drought broke in September with 3 days of rain that left everyone on the plains with the particular relief of people who have been holding their breath for 2 months. And the grass came back in the fall with a greenness that was almost aggressive, as if the land was trying to make up for lost time. The Fairchild cattle came through it in reasonable shape, and the fall sale was adequate if not exceptional, and the books ended the year in the black, which was more than could be said for several of their neighbors. Dorothy sat with the year-end accounts in December, the lamp burning in the study. She worked in Elias the Elder's study now, at his desk, the tintype still on the wall, the boots still by the door because she had never moved them, and she felt the satisfying solidity of numbers that told a true story. Little Elias was asleep upstairs, 2 years old and growing fast, and the house was warm and the ranch was safe, and the man she had married was reading in the parlor, and she thought about the train into Caldwell 4 years ago, and the flat pewter sky, and the $47 and the plan. She had left St. Louis intending to leave Caldwell richer. She had done that. She had done it and beyond it, and passed it into territory that the word richer could barely contain. She wrote in the household journal at the bottom of the year-end accounts in her neat, precise handwriting, 4 years. Everything I intended and everything I did not intend. Both have been worth every mile. The following spring, she told Luke she was expecting again. He reacted exactly as he had the first time: the long look across the kitchen table, the rising and coming around and the holding, and she thought, "This will always be the same, and that is one of the finest things I have ever known." Their second child, born in the autumn of 1887, was a girl. She arrived with a full voice and an expression of determined curiosity that made the delivering doctor from Caldwell say she looked like she had arrived with opinions ready. They named her Clara Jean Fairchild, and she was from the beginning a person of strong preferences and great charm, which was an interesting combination to observe in an infant, but which surprised no one who had spent time with her mother. Elias was 3 when Clara was born, and he took his role as older brother with a seriousness that was familiar. He stood next to the cradle and looked at her with big eyes and said, to no one in particular, "She is very small," and Dorothy said, "You are also very small," and Elias considered this information carefully and seemed to find it a useful perspective. The ranch moved into the late 1880s with the settled confidence of a place that has found its rhythm. Amos Reed, who had turned 60 and showed no particular interest in slowing down, ran the hands with the same quiet authority, though Dorothy noticed that he was letting the younger men take more of the heavy work now without making an issue of it, which she respected. Ernesto had married a woman from Caldwell, a Mexican-American woman named Rosalinda, who was a fine horsewoman, and who Dorothy liked immediately with the directness that Dorothy liked people she recognized as substantial. And Ernesto had settled on the ranch in a more permanent way that everyone treated as natural and right. Callum had, against all early predictions, developed into one of the better cattlemen on the ranch, and Amos acknowledged this in the particular Amos way, which involved saying one afternoon that Callum was not entirely useless, which everyone understood as the highest available praise. The children grew through those years with the particular energy of ranch children who have unlimited space and constant work and interesting adults around them. Elias was quiet and observant like his father, with his mother's precision, and he took to the cattle work early with a seriousness that Luke found deeply moving in a way he was not entirely able to articulate. Clara was different, vivid, and verbal, and possessed of a quality of attention that could fix on something and simply not let go, which Luke said was entirely her mother's doing and Dorothy said was a reasonable assessment. Dorothy taught them both to read with the same thorough competency she applied to everything, and the Caldwell schoolteacher, when Elias started attending, told Dorothy that her son was the best prepared student she had seen in years, which Dorothy received as information rather than a compliment, and immediately began thinking about how to build on it. She had not stopped reading herself. The Dickinson was joined by other volumes over the years, a practical agricultural manual, several histories, a collection of Emerson that she and Luke read aloud to each other on winter evenings, a novel or two. The green cloth-covered Dickinson sat always on the corner of the study desk, its pages marked with thread in a dozen places. She had never moved it from the center of her reading life, because it had been the first thing anyone had given her that was only for the pleasure of it, and that fact retained its meaning. In the spring of 1889, Dorothy found herself at the creek with both children on a Saturday afternoon in April Elias 4½, and conducting an investigation of the mud at the water's edge. Clara, a year and a half, and expressing strong opinions about the cottonwood seeds that were drifting past. Luke was working the fence line with Ernesto and would come home for supper, and Dorothy sat on the bank in the spring light and watched her children and the water and the budding trees and thought, with a clarity that was by now very familiar, about everything that had brought her here. She had, she thought, kept her original promise exactly. She had taken the job for one season. She had left richer, Both of these things were true, and neither of them was what she had meant at the time, and the distance between what she had meant and what had actually happened was exactly the distance between the woman on the train with $47 and the woman on the creek bank in the April light. Elias turned from the mud and said, "Mama, there are tadpoles," with the gravity of someone reporting important news. "I know," she said. "There are every spring. Are they always the same ones?" He asked with the precision of a child who has not yet decided where the limits of reasonable inquiry lie. "Different ones every year," she said, "but the creek is the same." He thought about this and seemed satisfied and went back to his investigation. Clara had found a stick and was using it for purposes known only to herself, with great concentration. Dorothy looked up the creek to where it curved out of sight to the south, and she thought about the word home. She had been homeless for a long time in the years before Caldwell, not literally, but in the way that matters more, which is the sense of being in a place that is exactly yours, that fits the shape of you, that you would return to from anywhere because it is the place that means you. She had thought on that train in October of 1882 that home was something you built alone, something you purchased with enough money and enough distance from the things that had hurt you. She had been right that you built it. She had been wrong about the alone part. There were footsteps on the bank behind her, and she turned, and Luke was there back early from the fence line, his boots dirty and his hat pushed back, and a strand of grass caught in his shirt, and he looked the way he always looked when he was coming back to the house after work, which was the way of a man who is glad to be returning to something specific and particular. He sat down beside her on the bank and looked at the children and then at her, and she leaned against him, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they sat there together in the April light listening to the creek and watching Elias and Clara in their separate profound absorptions. "Good day?" he asked. "Perfect," she said. He kissed her temple and they sat in the comfortable silence that had become, over these years, one of the richest things she possessed. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say to each other, but the silence of people who have already said a great deal and are sitting in the warmth of it. The creek ran on over the stones, clear and cold and constant, fed by the same spring that had fed it since before either of them had ever been born, that would feed it long after their children's children were grown. The cottonwoods were in their full spring green, and the sky above the plains was the particular and improbable blue that Kansas saved for its best spring days, the kind of blue that made you understand why people had come to this flat, difficult, magnificent country and decided to stay. Dorothy looked at the land, at her children, at her husband, at the creek, and felt the particular and complete satisfaction of a woman who has kept every promise she made and found that the promises meant more than she knew when she made them. She had said she would take the job for one season and leave richer. She had done exactly that. She had simply, by spring, learned to define rich the way it had always deserved to be defined, not as the number in a ledger or the coins in a carpet bag, but as the weight of things that cannot be counted at all. The morning light on the kitchen table, the sound of her son's voice reporting tadpoles, the warmth of her daughter's absolute conviction that her stick was important, the specific and irreplaceable feeling of being held by the one person in the world who had looked at her in the October cold and hoped she would understand what she was really walking toward. She had understood. Eventually, thoroughly, completely. And in the years that came after the quiet years and the hard years and the full years of life on the Kansas plain, she would look back on the woman with the carpetbag and the $47 and the plan, and she would feel for her only the purest compassion. That woman had been right about everything except what everything meant. And everything, as it turned out, had meant this. The creek and the spring light and the children and the man beside her, and the house on the rise above the pasture with the white paint that was, she had already noted in her careful interior ledger, going to need attention before autumn, and the whole wide, breathing, living fact of a life that was hers in every sense of the word. Richer. Yes, every possible kind of richer there was.